Well, from an early age, let me just tell you, I sensed the call to ministry. My dad was a pastor for many years, and I used to go with him to church almost any time that the church doors were open. I loved every aspect of it. Whereas most kids were raised on, sports and video games, I was raised with Salty. You guys remember that Bible character, all right? I was raised with Adventures in Odyssey, and I was raised with comic book Bibles. They exist, they're awesome, okay? I was raised, and I loved it. Every minute of it, I absolutely adored being in church, and I was given all kinds of opportunities to serve, even at a young age. I was raised in a church that was gracious enough to nurture that desire. And even as I got older, and I kind of encountered this rebellious stage in high school where I cared a whole lot more about girls and football than I did about church, even after that, God got a hold of my heart, and he renewed with a passion my desire to go into local church ministry. And I remember attending a tablet information session, and I remember just being on campus and just feeling what it was like in the day and the life of a seminary student and a pastor. And I went home that night when Sarah and I came so long ago, and I went and I was in sort of a romantic stupor. I was just kind of walking around on clouds thinking, oh, wow, if God has called me to be a pastor, I not only have a job, I have a vocation, I have a calling. There's something so special about it. And I remember that night, even though I had a million things to do, I was in a really challenging semester in my undergraduate career at that time, getting ready for seminary. I remember, even though I had all that stuff to do, that I was overwhelmed by God's grace, by God's goodness. Oh, I was going to be a pastor, and that just brought joy to my heart. Now, all the while, I was an extremely idealistic and naive youth. I had made a solemn oath, an unswerving resolution that I was going to never, ever be entitled. After all, I didn't deserve the privilege of being a pastor. I would never be jaded. I had seen people around me in church ministry just kind of get this jaded attitude, they know people, they know how they are, and I'm going to avoid this and that. No, I was never going to be like that. I would never let the pristine beauty of ministry tire on me and get old. I also really resolved never to lead like the people around me had led. I had seen the destructive tendencies of toxic leadership around me, and I wanted to be a servant leader. I wanted to be different. But something happened shortly after I jumped headfirst into ministry. Something happened after I jumped headfirst into seminary as well. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to change. The rigors and the demands of full-time ministry, people calling all the time, preparing sermons, having to be on call almost all the time, that just took its toll on me. And then I completely underestimated how difficult seminary would be. My wonderful wife, became acquainted with the phrase Greek widow, taking all these times to memorize Greek paradigms, and then Hebrew was not easy at all either. So, I was always on the go. And I remember that slowly my attitude started to change as I juggled life and ministry and seminary and all these different things. Life seemed to come at me 1,000 miles an hour, and I had to learn how to deal and cope with it. And I did so in some unhealthy ways. Now, meanwhile, and I find this kind of interesting as I was reflecting on this, meanwhile, God started to do some really cool things with me in my past church when I was ministering. And in fact, these cool things kind of played against me later on. Now hear what I'm saying. I'm not here bragging for one moment. I see God's hand in all of this, but God allowed tremendous growth to happen in the college and young adults group that I was leading. It was really cool. It almost seemed to come a little bit easy for me in certain ways. Now again, I can look back and I can see that it was God doing that whole time, but what happens to a young and insecure and arrogant person when he begins to experience at a very, very young age success? It goes to your head. That's what happens, right? And I started to realize that I had certain things together that other people my age didn't. I was actually kind of a gift. I was a pretty cool guy, right? Now, here's what I'm getting at. The success that I experienced, the things that started to become overwhelming, it impacted me in a significant way. And it impacted how I viewed leadership. I started to even think of myself differently. I was the pastor, right? I was the one who was in charge. They, out there, they were the laity. Now, if you know Dr. Walt Russell, he talks about that distinction. He just hates it. But it became apparent in my mind. That's really what I started to think. And it wasn't so much God's ministry anymore. It was my ministry. And servants and volunteers who were there to serve God and serve the church, well, really, they were kind of there to serve me. Aaron and Hur, they held up the hands of Moses. Well, in like manner, the people at church, they should hold up my hands, right? I mean, I'm the one who's serving God. I'm God's man. Now, slowly and perceptibly, I began to think this way. I became entitled. I began to think that I deserved all these things because, again, after all, I'm God's man. Well, these changes in my attitude, these changes in my behavior, changes in thinking, they happened in other ways as well. Now, I still cared for people. That never changed, okay? But I avoided those people that drain the life out of you. You know, those people who need Jesus in such a deep and rich way. I started to avoid and steer clear of those conversations. I really couldn't be entangled in the mess of their lives. I stopped getting involved in community because, after all, that was difficult, that was messy, that was hard. I instead wanted to immerse myself in the original languages. I needed to look at Scripture and read it not only in its original languages, I needed to make sure that I applied correct hermeneutical constructs to this. And I needed also to realize how it is that I could exegete this. And of course, I needed to make sure that I presented it in a very creative and fun way. Because after all, as a very insecure young guy, the way that I got my ego boost was by doing something that people would come up to me and say, wow, that was a really good sermon. That was a really creative way that you packaged that. Now, quick note, of course, I think that the preaching of God's word is still preeminently important. But I want you to notice the kind of descent that I took from pastoral ministry into just becoming a lecturer, into just someone kind of herding people in, giving them Jesus or feeding them and then getting them out. And finally, my spiritual disciplines in my devotional life began to suffer, and they began to suffer really bad. I all but stopped reading my Bible, except for preparation, of course, except for, getting ready for studies, and prayer really became an afterthought. Now, interestingly, unlike what most people say, seminary destroyed my career, seminary destroyed my faith, rather. No, that's not what happened to me at all. My professors were vibrant in their faith. They were helpful in steering me back to the fact that you can't read the Bible as just a textbook. You need to read it as a living, breathing Word of God. But it was ministry, interestingly enough, and the demands and the rigors of ministry that drove me as far away from Jesus as I really could be. And all through this, I didn't consciously isolate myself, but I isolated myself relationally nonetheless. I had token accountability, right? I mean, I had people around me that I could use the right lingo to, and I had planned vulnerability. I'd say things like, oh, brother, I'm struggling with this, and it was a total non-issue, right? And then I wouldn't really get to the bottom of what was actually going on in my heart. After all, here's the thought that was going on in my mind. Who would listen to me if they knew that I didn't even read my Bible? Who would really want to hear someone talk about closeness with God if they knew that I struggled praying? No one's going to want to listen to me. But this is my gig. This is my job, and so I better get up, and I better talk, and I better do it well. Now, this drove me even further into relational isolation. But here's the thing. I didn't realize it. It's so deceptive. It's so easy to fall into. It doesn't happen overnight. And before you guys think I'm a monster, right, I didn't think all of these thoughts at once. In fact, if I would have verbalized any one of these things about who I thought that I was, it would have made me sick. But the fact remains, they came up. They reared their ugly head at me, and I embraced them. I accepted them. Now, in this place, I felt hollow. I felt empty. I felt frustrated. I felt hypocritical. And all of you who know how much energy that it takes to maintain a smiling face when inside everything is falling apart, you know how awful this is. It's kind of like this. And when I was a kid, I used to clean my room when my mom would tell me to, and I would do it just by scooping up my toys and scooping up, my clothes and just stuffing it in the closet. And as quick as I could, I just slammed the door, right? And all these things are ready to burst out. Now, my mom was smart. She knew that I wouldn't get away with that, but I thought if I could just kind of stay in front of the door and just kind of smile and just kind of avoid the fact that I had swept everything away from what was public and what she could see, that I'd be fine. And even that little situation as a little boy trying to hide things from my mom, even that was a little bit stressful. But let me tell you, as a pastor trying to present a front where everything's fine and everything's good when it's really not, that's far more stressful. And it takes a lot more energy, and it takes a toll on your life. Now, what's so interesting and what's really sad about this is that my story is not uncommon. I started reading around, and I started understanding that an inordinate amount of books of this type have been dedicated to would-be pastors and aspiring church leaders. Now, all these books are an eerie testimony of the dangers of pastoral ministry. My friend just started reading a book called Dangerous Calling by Paul David Tripp. He was telling me all about that, how dangerous pastoral ministry is. I mean, I read a book for one of Dr. Boersma's classes called Clergy, Couples, in Crisis. And listen, if you want a scary read, if you are a young married couple, don't read Stephen King or anything. Read Clergy, Couples, in Crisis. It's awful. You'll think about how your marriage is going to dissolve within 5 years of the ministry. And then my pastor, Mike Erie, wrote Death by Church. And in it, in the very beginning, he cites some frightening statistics about how awful it is that some pastors have to respond in such a way, and the burnout rate, and how easy it is for people to go into ministry with all of these expectations, all these exciting prospects, and leave it so quickly. This all took a toll on me, because pastoral ministry is a scary thing. It's a tall order, and it's often detrimental if you're not careful to your health, spiritually, emotionally, relationally, and even physically. Now, I think there's a reason for this, okay? I think that there's a biblical reason at that. I believe that the reason that Christian leadership, and in particular pastoral leadership, is often so difficult is because we're trying to do it the world's way. We're borrowing principles from the world to inform how we do church. We're trying to lead from the top when Jesus encourages us to lead from the bottom. And in doing so, we are forgetting everything that our master told us to do. We're forsaking the way of the master so that we can go the way of Wall Street. If you have your Bibles with me, I encourage you to open up to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, starting at verse 24, Jesus is concluding his ministry here on earth. His 3 years are coming to a close. Luke chapter 2, verse 24, he's getting ready to tell his disciples something so foundational, something so important. And he says, the author says, a dispute arose among them as to which would be regarded as the greatest. And he, Jesus, said to them, the kings of the Gentile exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become the youngest, and the leader as the one who serves. For who's the greater? One who reclines at the table, or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at the table? But I am among you as the one who serves. Now, what would you do if you just had a few hours left on earth? What would you say to your loved ones? What would you say to the people around you who are dearest to you? Jesus has a handful of hours, and he could address any topic that he could. I mean, he could address eschatology. He could address finer points of systematic theology. But what he addresses is servant leadership. So foundational is this principle that it's not just found in one gospel. It's found in all three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And not only that, it is found, and I found this really interesting, it is found at different points in Jesus' ministry. Now, this is really interesting because source critics have a field day with this. In Matthew, for instance, you got Jesus saying the same kind of thing right before his triumphal entry. In Mark, you've got it right after his transfiguration. In Luke, you have it right at the end of his life. And so source critics, especially liberal ones, will say things like this. Obviously, the redactors or the editors of the New Testament got this really confused. And so this proves that the text of the New Testament is really not that authentic and therefore can't be trusted. But as I was reading and as I was doing my exegesis on this, I found one author that said something so brilliant. It makes complete sense that Jesus would have said this more than one point at his ministry. It makes perfect sense that his dull followers, us included, would have needed this again and again and again. Why? Because like I said in the beginning, we need to be reminded more than we need to be instructed. This passage is so absolutely indispensable to how we do things, and it is so opposite of what the world says, isn't it? The world tells you to lead from the top. The world has you position yourself. The world has you to do these things so that you can be all the way on the top, calling the shots. Well, servant leadership goes from the bottom all the way up. Now, I think it's really important to acknowledge that servant leadership is a lot of work. In fact, I think it's fair to say that servant leadership is the worst form of leadership if you want to be the guy who has it all together, like I wanted to be. If you want to be the woman who has all the answers, avoid servant leadership like it's the last thing you want to do. I mean, if you want to be the person who doesn't get muddied up in other people's problems and issues, don't be a servant leader. If you want to be a superstar teacher who doesn't do anything else other than that, don't be a servant leader. If you want to be a super efficient, vision-casting, efficient decision maker, you can't be a servant leader. Why? Because that involves being on the bottom instead of being on the top. And servant leadership doesn't work if you want to do that. Servant leadership, by its very nature, means that you're on the bottom. That's what Jesus is trying to convey in this passage. And that's why he points out, interestingly enough, that if you want to be the greatest, not here in Luke do you have to be the least, but he says actually you have to be the youngest. Why? Because in that culture, and even to some extent our own culture, age had no respect. It had no status. It had no ascribed worth to it. Age meant that you were really lowly, small, low on the totem pole. And I remember vividly entering into pastoral ministry as a 23-year-old, and they gave me the opportunity to teach 18 to 35-year-olds. I was teaching some people who had over 10 and sometimes 15 years on me, and boy, did I try to overcompensate. I tried to have all those answers. I tried to be the guy in the room who knew what was going on and have everything covered, and boy, God humbled me. And God allowed me to come into a loving church, a church like Evie Free where people around me are servant leaders, where the person that I answer to directly will ask me questions like, how can I help you? How can I serve you? How can I better equip you to do your job? I talked with my pastor a while ago about some horrible things that were going on in my personal life. And I let him know, professionally, there's something that I can't do. He had the opportunity right then to say, if you can't perform professionally, if you can't do what I hired you to do, then you're out of here. But instead of doing that, he prayed for me. He lifted me up. He allowed me to go through the pain. He allowed me to be vulnerable. That's what Jesus is talking about here, the fact that we need to be vulnerable. We need to not be on top all the time and have things together and be fine and good and have everything just perfectly in a little box with a bow tied around it. We're not called to be that. We're called to be people of the Word. We're called to be people who authoritatively teach. We're called to be people who lead. There is no doubt about that, but we're called to be servants first. Now, I think this is very interesting. At my last church, I had an opportunity to do an assignment where I did a very, very unscientific survey, but it was very revealing nonetheless. And in this survey, I asked people from different fields to tell me some keys that they think would be important for me as a pastoral leader to put into practice as I tried to lead people. Listen to some of these. One guy said, as a leader, make sure that people see you as their superior. They need to minister. They don't need an equal. As a leader, this is another person, always be suspicious of other people. They want something from you. If you can find out what that is, you can expose it. Another one said, as a leader, find strengths in others. Well, wait a second, that sounds good, right? Well, listen, find strengths in others so that they can do the tasks that you don't want to do. And then my favorite, as a leader, don't get close to people. Remain aloof. It'll save you a lot of heartache in the end when they leave you and abandon you. Well, gosh, no wonder pastors are leaving in droves. No wonder they're throwing in the towel after 1, 2, 3 years of pastoral ministry. And no wonder that the ones who do stay are not leading Jesus' way. They're leading the world's way. Because who would? Who would be vulnerable in a world that's just going to treat you like that? But we need to be reminded again and again and again of the way of the Master, of Jesus' way, of being a bottom-up leader instead of a top-down leader, of being a topsy-turvy leader in terms of the values that we have, of being a leader who's going to love people and be vulnerable in front of people and tell them that, hey, I'm trying to help you come into God's presence, but I'm also trying to go into God's presence as well. I'm broken. I'm messed up just like you. Let's be the church together. That's what God's calling us to do. And it's my purpose to tell you that today. Now, I entitled my message, It's Lonely at the Top. And it really is. Positioning yourself for power will wear you out spiritually. It'll wear you out emotionally. It'll wear you out relationally. And it'll wear you out physically. It did me. And thank God that I came into a place that loved me and cared for me. But boy, if I would have remained on that trajectory, it would have been destruction for sure. And that's because we're never meant to be on the top. See, God was. God's meant to be there. So if it's lonely at the top, get down. You don't belong there anyway. Put God back up on the top and just see how he'll use you.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.